I have analyzed countless chess games of Magnus Carlsen starting from his openings, mid-game, and all the way up to his endgame tactics. In this video, we will break down everything and, in the process, make you a better chess player and hopefully narrow the distance between you and Magnus. But enough talking, let's get immediately into openings. First, Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. Looking into only tournament games, the most popular opening Magnus has played as white is the Ruy Lopez Berlin defense with 56 total games. From those, he has only lost 9 games, won 33, and drew 14. But why is this opening so good? Well, let's look at it. White opens up with e4 and black follows with e5. You put the knight out attacking the pawn and black defends. Then you move the bishop to f5 attacking the knight. Black responds with knight to f6 attacking your pawn on e4. After this, most players would castle on the king side, and 50% of all those games would end in a draw. But that's not what Magnus does. Magnus always likes to place the pawn on d3 to protect the pawn here, and then Magnus chooses the move order based on his preparation. If the opponent goes to c5 with his bishop, white follows with the castling. Black opens up the path for the bishop while defending his pawn, and then Magnus stops it from getting close to the knight with the pawn h3 move. Then Magnus takes the knight after the bishop is threatened. But sometimes he also switches the order by taking the knight immediately and then developing his other pieces. Like, a funny example is this game in 2022. After the exchange, Magnus just decides to attack the king side while keeping the king seemingly wide exposed. Ruy Lopez offers a few options in how you want to proceed with the game, but keep in mind something important. Most games with this opening will end up with both black and white castling kingside. The white pieces will focus their attack on kingside. Meanwhile, the black pieces will instead protect and focus on attack through the queenside. Overall though, the kingside is where the battlefield is going to happen. A funny game between Magnus and against Anishkiri ended up with both players castling queenside, and the endgame speaks for itself. Now let's go over the second most popular opening. The Queen's Gambit declined. Though you might be confused on the difference between Queen's Gambit accepted and the declined version. Trust me, it sounds complicated, but it really isn't. The game begins and white plays d4. Opponent follows with d5. Then white pushes pawn to c4. This is the Queen's Gambit starting position, and the opponent will do one of these two things. Defend the pawn with e6, or just take the pawn. By taking, you accept the gambit. By defending, you decline. Most grandmasters, including Magnus, will choose the declined variation because at this level, it just seems safer to do with the black pieces. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with accepting the gambit, but the only thing to remember is if you accept, then this pawn here is as good as gone, and you should focus on developing your other pieces. In this game between Maxim and Magnus, Maxim won even though he accepted the gambit. With 23 wins and 7 losses, how does Magnus play the declined version when he is playing the white pieces? Well, pretty standard actually. The board almost always ends up like this. The bishop is on f4, both knights are out covering the center, and there is a solid pawn chain here. Black, on the other hand, is more defensive. His knight is protecting this pawn and covering the center. The bishop stops any potential knight pin while still being developed on this important diagonal, and the king is tucked away in safety. One thing I must warn you about though, is that this opening becomes really complex during the mid-game because of how many possible moves both you and your opponent really have. In some games, Magnus likes to take this pawn here. In this 2020 game against Hikaru, Magnus pushed this c4 pawn forward. Alireza in 2022 after developing took the pawn, and then managed to snatch the win away from Magnus. Queen's Gambit being so complex is probably why he played this opening in 53 games with white. But funny enough, this opening is also second place with 50 games in which Magnus has the black pieces, with 11 wins, 7 losses, and 32 draws. Now it's time to find out what Magnus's most popular opening as black is, and probably his favorite opening in general. Based on the numbers, Magnus has played the Sicilian defense 115 times. Here's how the Sicilian defense usually goes. White plays e4, black follows with pawn to c5, white puts the knight out in f3, and black follows with a knight of his own c6. This is how 115 games have gone so far, but then the opening can change a bit. If white plays bishop to b5, then that is how 59 of those games have gone, with 16 wins, 12 losses, and 21 draws. Here, Magnus typically will push the pawn to e6 or e5. The other 56 games have gone differently, with 16 wins, 8 losses, and 32 draws. It's still the Sicilian opening, but this time white will play pawn to d4. Black will take, and then white will take with the knight. Then both players put out their knights. After this, Magnus always follows with pawn to e5 to push the knight out and take back some control of the center. All these openings are great, and Magnus is known as the guy who tries different openings just for the fun of it, but he is probably going to be remembered for the Sicilian defense. With so many successful games, it's kind of obvious why everyone and their grandma started playing the Sicilian. Now we are moving on to mid-game, and things aren't so simple as looking at numbers anymore. However, you are still in luck because I have identified a simple tactic that Magnus constantly uses in his mid-game all the way up to endgames. It's called pace control, and I have the perfect game to show you how Magnus uses it. Here the opponent has the white pieces, and it looks terrible for Magnus. After all, this knight here is targeting the queen, and most of the black pieces are not doing much, except for this bishop that is targeting the white rook. Not to mention most pieces are close together, meaning a fork from the knight is very possible. So, what does Magnus do? If you thought queen to d8, good job, you defended your queen, but you are playing the game of your opponent. Magnus instead planned something else. He moved queen to e8. This seems kind of scary. After all, knight to c7 is just waiting to fork both the queen and the rook. However, Magnus knows that by moving the queen here, he is creating a bigger attack than the opponent. If the opponent moves the knight, Magnus takes, and after a few exchanges, he ends up with the piece up. Of course, the opponent doesn't do that, and instead retreats his rook. But this is only move 1 into controlling the pace. Magnus's next move is something that a normal human would probably never do. He goes bishop to d8. This looks terrible and goes against many chess principles. But Magnus does not see it that way. Here is why Magnus made that weird move. First, he wanted to block the knight. If you watched my knights video, you know that a bishop 3 squares away completely counters the knight. Secondly, Magnus had plans to pressure the white bishop, and in the process, he wanted to get rid of this weak pawn. But third and most importantly, Magnus wanted to disorganize the opponent and make him feel like he's losing control of the game. This pace control tactic is used in almost every sport. But no one does it as well in chess as Magnus Carlsen. His memory and calculation offer him a great advantage, but you too can use this tactic. Find out what the opponent wants to do, and think of other possibilities of what to do. Trust me, it's going to end well for you. Now it's time for the endgame, and here's where most grandmasters really fear Magnus. There are 2 reasons why Magnus Carlsen is known as the endgame god. The first one is obvious. This man is really good at endgames when it comes to calculating. But the second reason is because Magnus literally changed the game with how he approaches endgames. Here's a quick history lesson. Before Magnus Carlsen, grandmasters would draw games a lot, and that made chess a bit boring. They had the idea that if an endgame reaches a point of theoretical draw, then it wasn't worth playing it out and getting tired over nothing. Then Magnus Carlsen comes in and completely changes the game. Magnus believed that almost every endgame can be won, and a simple mistake can determine the game. After all, humans aren't chess robots, and they can make mistakes due to fatigue or pressure. The best example is this game of Magnus vs Nepo in 2021. The game lasted 8 hours, and the endgame was brutal. Both players shuffled their pieces for 50 moves, and for this whole time, it was a theoretical draw. But Magnus knew that Nepo would succumb to the pressure sooner or later, and that is why he won in the end. I know that I said Magnus was going to be known for his Sicilian defense, but his resilience in the endgames literally influenced the new generation to play like he does. So as overdone as this trope may be, if you want to play like Magnus Carlsen, you must never give up no matter how bad a position might look. But also, you still have to learn a lot. And I suggest you start with this video that will completely change how you use pawns in your chess games, and will probably make you win a lot more endgames. Or more precisely, win endgames in the Magnus Carlsen style of dominating the game using pawns.